All right. So for our attendees, what this is going to be is a little different from the previous talks. This is going to be basically your opportunity to ask this panel basically any question that you've ever really been curious about when we talk about migrating from open source to Puppet Enterprise. The best way to do that is to use the Q&A function that we've been talking about this whole Puppet Camp at the bottom of your Zoom session. And we'll be monitoring those questions coming in so that we make sure we ask the panel.
Just drop it wide open, why don't you, Jamie? Any question, the world's your oyster.
Any question your heart desires, yes. All right, so to kick things off, why don't we do a round of introductions so everybody knows who's on the panel. So Ben Ford, do you want to kick it off with your introduction?
Sure. My name is Ben. I just realized that my light is off. I should probably fix that in a second. My name is Ben Ford. I am pretty active in the community as Ben42K, so you may have seen me around. And I've moved through several roles at Puppet. I was pro services, so I went out on a lot of engagements and did some of this work myself. And then I moved into education, and I wrote a lot of like enablement, a lot of training, and talked about like some of the things that you would need to account for, and like how to write good code to make it easy to upgrade and all of that. And then I moved through community, and now I'm doing product manager work for the ecosystem and the developer experience. So you may have noticed that I dropped a couple of links in for like PDK Go and some other things. That's because that's my wheelhouse right now, is I'm building tools that are going to help make it easier for you to do all of this work that we're going to talk about today.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. Garrett, you want to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, hi. I'm Garrett Rowell, professional service engineer here at Puppet. I've been with the company a little bit over a year now. Been a long time active in the community. Actually learned Puppet on open source. So yeah, that's pretty much me.
All right, thanks, Garrett. And Jarett.
Hi, I'm Jarett Lavallee. I'm one of the principal support engineers on the support team at Puppet. I help Puppet Enterprise customers go through and solve issues. I also work on the OSP Assist portal, helping to do some of those optimization presentations.
Thanks, Jarett. And Jessykah.
Jessykah Byrd. I'm a principal professional services engineer at Puppet. I've been with Puppet for about 4 years, and I came from an open source background. And some of my early interactions was actually with Ben Ford on how do I rip apart the SSL certificate, the communication between the agent and the server. So things, I've done open source form and done a lot of really dumb things with Puppet just to see if I could.
Awesome.
So she's a Windows wizard. So if you have any questions about doing Windows updates or migrating Windows nodes, make sure to get those out.
That's very true. All right, so we've got the right people on the panel. Let's open this up for questions. I'll kick off the first one. So what is the most asked question that you get when it comes to migrating from open source to PE?
I mean, it's kind of a big thing, but people always ask like, what's going to break? How do I know what's going to break? I think that's the number one question that I get, but that's sort of like such a big, open, broad question that I don't know how to answer that completely. That was what we talked about all day, right?
Yeah, and I feel like that was definitely Aaron's talk, right? What are the tools in your toolbox that you have when you do the migration so that you can be aware and hopefully prevent, any major breakage when you migrate?
And depending on what you're using as an ENC from open source, you're going to lose tools, you're going to lose variables, settings, things like that you have to be aware of and cognizant. And as mentioned on the talk, there people that set it up may not be around to explain what's going on. And so some of the tools that were mentioned, like Catalog Diff, OneSover, will at least help identify those as you're planning.
That is a real good argument for writing good code in the first place, right?
Yeah, really is. How can I prove it's doing what it's actually doing?
If we take this a step further, what do you all really wish that like people in the community knew about migrating?
I guess from my perspective, right, I'm on the sport team. I get to see where it fails, right? There will always be some small failures as things go along. Usually it's a single agent or whatever, but as long as you've tested your process, you know how to move over and how to roll back just in case, you should be pretty successful.
I think my thing is that it's not really Puppet specific or like code specific or anything, but just the idea of being able to kind of like narrow down what failures might be and just kind of like methodically think about like, if I'm getting this failure, it can't be from this class of things, but if I'm getting this failure, it can be this other thing. And we just changed something about the environment which could affect that. Maybe that's correlated. You know, that idea of like being able to, instead of looking at the entire world and going, oh my God, something is wrong, something is broken, being able to kind of like correlate and kind of narrow down the class of things that can be wrong, because it makes it so much easier to identify, like if you're looking through three or four different things that might be a problem, that's a lot easier than just looking at the whole thing and trying to like whack-a-mole figure something out.
And we kind of recommend, breaking your stuff into modules. So we've got the roles and profiles at the control repo level, but then when you're developing things internally, we recommend that you make it kind of a module. Nowadays, you can use PDK that has built-in spec testing. You can get an idea of what sort of rat's nest your Puppet code might be when you start tracking those dependencies. And that sort of toolkit that you get with PDK provides an ability to spec test. And once you're on Puppet 4 and up, PDK will even allow you to compile your code against Puppet 6, against Puppet 7, so you can see how that's going to work and whether things are going to meet expectations or skip them as you're planning your moves. You can pre-plan all of that before you even have that code touching a development or testing box.
And you all have a ton of experience in this area. What are some of the common challenges that you see, as you work with others that are migrating to PE? Putting
like
you
this
on the
awkward
spot
moment
here
in the middle here where everybody's like,
Hey.
all right, who's going to be the first one that steps up and says the words? I think, honestly, I think that the hardest part is sort of like understanding the difference between, I think Jessykah mentioned it a little bit ago, of like when you have data classification, variables, anything that's coming from something that you built custom, like the ENC or something like that. And then just understanding where that code's going to, or like how that's going to change. It feels like it's kind of black box for a lot of people, and it's hard to like make predictions about what's going to happen.
And Puppet Enterprise it gives you a bunch of things out of the box. But if you've got your own ENC script that's doing classification or whatever else, you don't have to use that. When you're doing the migration to Puppet Enterprise, you can get all the benefits of the APIs and stuff as long as you kind of plan the migration and still use your existing script as you're getting everything migrated over. Most teams will find that they eventually want to get rid of that script because that's been a lot of development time, maintaining it, updating it, babysitting it. Depending on how you're doing code deployments, code managers substantially better than some open source customers do like a patch solution. And so when it comes to rolling back, suddenly they've got a pain point because they can't really just roll back to a previous commit. They have to essentially say, oh, well, now we need to do a cherry pick, pull that commit out of this and make another commit to make the change back. And then it gets great if you've got the Git experience, but a lot of people just don't have it.
Speaking as somebody who has built a whole ton of like bespoke solutions for various things, like a lot of the stuff that ran our classroom, for example, when I was in education, it always makes me so happy when we can retire something that I built. It's like I get excited. I'm like, yay, I don't have to maintain it anymore.
Yeah, and you always have that like, oh yeah, I made this cool thing. And that's like, oh man, I made this. Definitely done that at my fair share of times.
few years later, like, why did I make this? Why did I?
It seemed really cool at the time, but after supporting it for X amount of years, it's like, yes, it's finally gone.
There's one specific question here, right? Which is when we talk about our open source customers who are using site.pp for classification. So how would someone translate the site.pp classification to PE's way of doing things? And honestly, what is PE's way of doing things?
You know, actually, that maybe I could even take like one step higher there and say that you don't have to just like jump in and boil the ocean and take everything that was in site PP and like turn it all into PE console classification all at once. I mean, you get benefits from doing that, but obviously when you do a whole bunch of things all at once, there's more chances for something to break. So you can absolutely move into the PE world without changing classification that's in site PP. The challenge, I think Chris mentioned it earlier, is that then that gives you like two sources of truth. You don't have a single source of truth. But as long as it's like clearly documented, as long as you have a clear expectation of where that is, and you know where to go look, that's okay. So I would recommend not making that transition immediately, and then like doing it very intentionally, especially where you can make a small change and then test that small change.
And we have Puppet Enterprise customers that just do site.pp. They do a higher lookup for the role, based off of like a trusted pp_role fact, and that works just fine. So there's lots of ways to approach it, and how you choose to find it best is the best way to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, I've had customers that are using the PE classifier to only set the environment, right? And then the next step is to evaluate that site.pp to where they have just a default no definition that includes some base, right? That keys off of what OS you're on. And then from there it goes. So it's definitely not a one size fit all solution, but there's multiple ways to do things.
So what I'm hearing is that you don't have to change your classification strategy right off the bat. It's something that you can slowly evolve into, and as Ben said, be very intentional about it.
Yeah.
All right. Is there, we have a lot of people out in the open source community who are using Foreman. Is there an alternative to Foreman's host groups for those that want to move to Puppet Enterprise?
That sounds like a Jessykah question. I think that you let out the secret that you're a Foreman expert.
Yeah. So Puppet Enterprise's console actually supports the ability to put in higher values and variables in the different groups. You'll want some way to control that for versions, but that's our closest parallel when it comes to Puppet Enterprise. Foreman does a couple of things like building in facts and depending on where you're setting the value, and that'll end up resulting in a little bit of a different experience as you make the transition.
And another question, are there any code differences that you might need to account for when you talk about migrating to Puppet Enterprise? I think this is a multifaceted answer, depending on some of the circumstances, but take it away.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that same thing. It's like, there's like 12 different ways to answer this question, right? Because it's like, sometimes this involves an upgrade. Like we talked about a lot of different ways of doing upgrade strategies. And sometimes it's just like a more like straightforward migration. But I think what it really depends on is identifying what version of Puppet itself that you're moving from and moving to, and then looking to see what's different between those two. Like, for example, if you have Puppet 5 in your infrastructure, and then you want to move to something like a current supported Puppet Enterprise, one of the new things you can do is deferred functions. And there were a lot of people that had like weird, like hacky workarounds for that in the past, and you could clean up your code a little bit. like I've said a couple of times, I don't think you should do all the things all at once. So maybe that's the thing, like you do the migration and then you work on that cleanup. But being aware of those things are like I think that's kind of key. One thing that you might run into though is that we moved some of the core resource types out of Puppet and into modules, which means that depending on where, like what your particular circumstances are, you may have to add some modules to your testing pipeline. They're bundled now. They come with the Puppet agent package. So like your nodes themselves, the agents shouldn't notice any difference, but your tests might unexpectedly fail because if you gem install Puppet, you don't always get the same kind of, you don't get all the same modules that come with the Puppet agent package.
And then, because Puppet is infrastructure management, you kind of expect Puppet's managing Puppet, and Puppet Enterprise typically manages itself. So that's code you kind of consider refactoring away, or at least have to address, depending on how you're interacting and lifecycle management of Puppet's agents as well as Puppet server.
And then if you're using other tools like mCollective or things like that, you can take advantage of tasks and plans using our TCP protocol. So a lot of customers will start adopting that. They don't have to do it immediately, but they start doing that after they've migrated over.
That was a good point that you brought up, Jessykah. Are there, and maybe Jarett would be the one that would know this better because you run into it in support all the time, but are there like classification differences that you're going to have to be aware of if you move to PE, or is that more or less taken care of for you? I know that I've had circumstances in the past where I was declaring something and then changed the version of Puppet or Puppet Enterprise and like ended up with a resource conflict or something.
One of the benefits of Puppet Enterprise is that it does manage itself. We have code that allows you to configure things on the agents and basically do everything you can on the infrastructure. So if you had code that did that, you probably need to remove it. We also, when we add these types of things into Puppet Enterprise, we are cognizant of, people have existing code that manages like the server or something like that within the puppet.conf. So usually we will add a higher parameter that you can add, or a parameter in a class that you can disable us from managing it. So if you do hit conflicts like that, it's usually easy to disable our management of it rather than taking it out of your code.
I think what I just heard you telling me is that I wrote bad code to begin with, Jarett. I could accept that.
Oh no, it's just that, moving from a platform that you were managing everything yourself, and we're going to Puppet Enterprise where we do some of that for you.
I remember a fun one that a couple customers ran into was that they were using the collector with package and yum repo. So they were just basically saying, oh yeah, make sure yum repo happens before package in every single case. And that tripped them up a little bit because they weren't using tags or anything to kind of limit the scope of impact there.
Yeah, that was a really bad one. Maybe we should like specifically call that out, that if you use a resource collector for Yum or for packages without having tags on it, it will literally install all of Puppet Enterprise on all the nodes just because all the packages will match that collector. So do watch out for that one.
That's a good one. Are there any general tips and tricks that any of you want to give in the context of, is there anything that you wish you would have known the first time that you did your first migration to PE? Because most of you have done many of these throughout your career. So anything specifically that sticks out to you that you wish you would have known?
It's surprisingly easy to stand up a parallel Puppet server so that you can intentionally move nodes and test them as you go, instead of trying to just do some sort of in-place upgrade and just magically hope that all the pieces fall in all the right places. I'm a big, if you haven't caught on, I'm a real big fan of doing very tiny incremental pieces instead of big changes at once.
Yeah, and I mean, doing it that way, right? You can directly call out, I want this particular node to now point over here and test it, right? And as you're doing that, hey, you can start building out your classifications more, and yeah, just slowly iterate. Don't try to boil the ocean all at once. Let's do these little individual things, focus on it until we refine it, and then move on to the next piece.
All right. So I guess what we'll do is, any last parting thoughts from the panel and from the audience, any last, minute burning questions that you're, dying to ask the panel here, now would be the time to do it.
I think that I have a question for Jarett, actually, is are there things that people can do that would not even just make the upgrade easier, but if something were to go wrong, are there things that people can do to prepare for that possibility so that it would make it easier for the support team to help?
It's a great question. And, a lot of that is just testing and validation in advance, right? Knowing your code's going to work, minimizing your changes. So, moving a couple nodes at a time if you're going to do a migration strategy. So if you can limit the scope of things, it's easier to troubleshoot, right? Especially if you're planning on doing a migration rather than an upgrade, we're not going to have to, live troubleshoot and live upgrade something that's impacting every node you have. So the smaller the change you can do, the easier it is. As far as, if you're in a situation where you'll need to work with support, the best thing you can do is just clearly identify what your issue is. We have tooling that allows us to collect logs and things like that. So you can run that in advance, get logs to us, we can review them faster, work with you. So yeah, and it's really a lot of what was talked about today is testing before things go, before you do the migrations or upgrades or whatever your plan is. But going in, you'll know you have better success.
All right. Any last parting thoughts from the panel before we wrap up? All right. Well, thank you so much to all of you for taking the time here on the panel to talk with the audience about migrating to PE and sharing some of your experience. I know I definitely learned a lot, so thank you so much.